We ready?
Good.
Ready.
Hooray.
Yeah, we're full. 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. This is the stpete.net meetup. We had a late MIT cancellation, so we kind of slipped in and going to present. It works on my machine, logging in .NET Core, logging in metrics in .NET Core. Before we get started, I want to be sure to thank Tech Systems for providing the pizza for tonight. Banco ZK Innovation Labs for providing the space. We've got a giveaway for a book a little bit later. Must be present to win. Afterwards, we're probably going to head down to the Avenue for drinks on your own dime, so please drink responsibly. We're always looking for more speakers, more topics, so if you're interested in hearing a particular speaker, a particular topic, want to volunteer yourself or a coworker, be sure to let us know and we'll get you on the list. Join the conversation on Meetup discussion boards. We're on Meetup. We've got a Facebook group that you can join discussions there. We've got a Twitter account that you can follow. We are now live streaming on YouTube and Twitch, so hopefully we've got some audience out there. So be sure to add your comments if you're watching. Do we have any announcements before we get started, or anybody want to have any questions or anything that they want to share? All right. Perfect. So who is using .NET Core in production? Anybody playing with .NET Core, maybe haven't yet started migrating applications or creating new applications? All right, so that's pretty much everybody, right? So .NET Core is the latest and greatest, and everybody loves it, right? We're mostly developers in the room, right? So who does logging and collects metrics with their applications? Who just kind of ships it and hopes for the best, right?
That's our whole feature. Yeah.
Right. So my name's John Callaway. I've been a professional software developer, mostly web applications since 1999, so I'm in my 20th year. Primarily a line of business applications, so a lot of CRUD screens, a lot of create, read, update, and delete screens, mostly boring stuff. I'm the co-founder, along with Clayton Hunt, who is running audio video for us this evening, of the stpete.net meetup, contributor to the Six Figure Developer blog and podcast. So if you haven't heard us on there, please subscribe, like, rate, review, all that kind of fun stuff. I always enjoyed learning new technology. I'm a Microsoft MVP and author of a TDD book, Test-Driven Development book in .NET Core, C#7. There's some chapters on React and JavaScript, all kinds of fun stuff. So I've been doing this a long time, really enjoyed what I do. So I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. Anybody want to admit to it again, that who kind of writes it, ships it, and then hopes for the best, right? We were speaking last night amongst the group on the podcast, in fact, about kind of the same topic, logging of metrics, and what do you collect, how do you collect it, what do you do? For the first half of my career, I was more or less a maintenance developer. I would come in on applications that were already in production. They were already effectively done. It was just adding new features, fixing bugs, going in and doing little things here and there. So if an application had existing logging, great, then I would follow suit and follow those same patterns. If it didn't, I would not go out of my way to add it, right? So with that in mind, if you're not doing any logging or metrics or data collection, how do you go about resolving bugs? Or how do you get bug reports to begin with? I got one client last week. I got a report that this feature isn't working, and that was it. So it was up to me to discover which feature were they talking about. They used a name, but sometimes user names versus developer names for a particular feature aren't always the same thing, right? So it's often very difficult to figure out what the bug is, what the defect is, what the feature is, where to start looking for these types of things, right? So when a bug is reported, do you struggle to repeat it? Yeah, I often struggle to repeat it, especially since I know how the application is intended to work, so I might not be the best person to try to cause a failure because I can avoid them pretty easily. You know, as we're working on these applications, how do you determine that it does work, that it does perform? How do you do you get requirements that say it must handle this amount of data, this amount of throughput, these number of users? Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. How do you know if you get the kind of requirements that I often get, which is maybe a bar napkin, maybe just a conversation in the hallway of, wouldn't it be neat if it did this? Oh yeah, go ahead and do that. How do you determine that you're successful, that you've implemented that feature correctly, that you've coded for the proper scenarios, all that kind of fun stuff, right? How do you determine that the thing you just delivered works? Do you just wait until somebody screams? Clayton's shaking his head because he said that last night, that if nobody's complaining, it must be working, right? I haven't heard from anyone. Nobody's yelling at me, so I must be doing a good job. And often, depending on the original requirements of the system or the original intended life, the intended lifetime of the application, maybe it was something that was only supposed to exist for 2 weeks, 6 months. Maybe we're not going to go through as much trouble to write in some kind of massive logging framework and analytics and collecting data and running reports to see how we're performing in a production environment. Anybody recognize either of these two screens?
All the time.
Yeah. So the yellow screen of death, and then the prettier .NET Core bluey screen of death, I guess. When an error happens, how are you alerted to that error? Is it really just that somebody comes and yells and say that that feature doesn't work? Maybe. How do you go about trying to reproduce those bugs? And I mentioned it earlier that maybe the user's using different terminology because they don't know what we called it in the back end. We didn't share, or we didn't bother to find out what they call it in the front on their side of things. So when an error happens, where's your first line of defense? Where do you go when somebody does start yelling at you? Anybody have any kind of go-tos? F12. Clayton's primarily a front-end developer these days, so he's going into DevTools and Firefox, Chrome, those types of things. So as long as you don't see red text, you're good, right?
Yeah, golden.
Perfect. So what about metrics? How do you determine that an application can handle the amount of volume that is anticipated? How do you find out what the volume that is anticipated is? I've been working on a project that I was initially told that it should handle, they were expecting up to about 10 million visitors per day in a busy season for a particular API endpoint in Azure. So with that knowledge, I knew that I had to be really tight on the amount of resources that I created and very quick to dispose of those things, right? So we want to make sure that we know what the intent, what the scope, and what the size of those things are so that we can handle them appropriately. Alternatively, if it's an application that's really only used by 10 different people during a week, maybe we don't need to concern ourselves too much with it, so we don't want to go through and start gold plating things and writing this Netflix size microservice heavy architecture and then deploy to a cloud environment that'll incur 6 figures of cost per day, per week, per month, whatever, right? Anybody doing any metrics collecting to determine how their application is performing? What are you using?
We're working on it. We have a messaging system.
Mm-hmm.
And we suddenly realized it went from 100,000 messages a month to 3 million. So
100,000?
This has been a huge
Yeah, 100,000 messages to 3 million messages a month
over a year.
over a year. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, when I first started, they had people, the guys next to me would say, yeah, I come in every day and query the database and check this and watch the queues and, hey, this is backing up. But I mean, somebody's got to manually log into the server and watch this stuff happen.
Yeah.
It's not like you can hit a dashboard and see. And how long does it take a message?
If somebody's not yelling.
We don't really know until somebody complains they haven't gotten one in a couple of days.
Right.
So yeah, we'd like to know how we wanted to improve the speed of the messages, but the only way to do that is to know how fast they're going now and know how fast they're going to go when we're done.
Yeah, you have to have.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to have a baseline. You have to have something to compare against. Yeah.
So the SLAs, the metrics, and the logging are all a huge focus right now. This is really appropriate.
Yeah. Do you think the increase in traffic or the increase in messages, is that due to more sales, more volume?
More sales.
Is that a good sign?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Often.
Until they back up.
Right.
And we're like, hey, such and such a messages haven't gone out in the last 2 days.
Yeah. So yeah, an increase in traffic, increase in messaging, that can often be a really good sign that maybe we're killing it. We're getting all kinds of web traffic. We're getting all kinds of orders. We're processing all kinds of data because of the things that we want. You know, we want the sales. We want the traffic. It also could be we had a deployment and somebody forgot to check something or check something incorrectly, and now we've got double the traffic for really no benefit. You know, maybe it's bad traffic. Maybe it's somebody trying to attack the network or attack the application, creating this barrage of messaging. So you kind of need to be able to track that and determine is this good? How do we respond to it? How do we handle it? And how do we scale for it in the future, right? With that too, it's important to figure out where those bottlenecks are. You know, is it as the message is being sent, as it's being delivered? Is it message processing? Where is that bottleneck? Is it something that you can control by a coding change? Is it something that you control by scaling something vertically or horizontally? You know, those are questions that you need to be asking to determine how we handle the data that we're receiving. How do we handle the information that we've learned based on that data, right? And then where do we go? Where do errors happen in our applications? You know, especially if you're doing some messaging system, message queues and things like that are in disparate parts of your environment that are working independently from one another, just working off of the messages. What happens when one of those microservices or something fails? You know, is it a Netflix scenario where Chaos Monkey reigns and is taking down the only instance of a particular microservice? So how do you handle that type of thing, right? With that, you need to be able to determine what the data is telling you. Has anybody seen this image before? Besides Clayton? All right, so I think this is back in World War II. They were collecting data from the bombers that were returning from their bombing missions to determine if we added armor to parts of the airplanes, where should we add the armor to be most effective? And based on this, where would you say that they initially thought that they should be adding the armor? Fuselage? So right in the middle there, where probably all the people are, maybe. Maybe the wingtips. Maybe the tail section. Because that looks like where all the damage is being sustained on the airplanes, right? But
Those are the ones that are good.
Yeah. What they determined was that the data that they were collecting was based on the airplanes that made it back. So these airplanes sustained damage in these red marked areas and were still able to return home. The ones that sustained damage on the engines and on the nose where the pilot, and close to the cockpit where the pilots are, they didn't return. So they didn't have that data. So it's a little bit misleading from first glance, right? So as you're collecting this data and determining or trying to determine where you need to invest dollars, man hours, coding changes, infrastructure, those types of things, you want to make sure that you understand what the data is telling you. You know, what needs your attention? Is it the messaging system? Is it a firewall? Is it a database? Is it, is it our application? Is it just calling back out? It's a third party call to some third party application. Make informed decisions by really understanding what that data is telling you. So, enough talking, because some people are sick of hearing us talk. So I'm going to show some live demo stuff, some code examples here. Put it in light theme, so hopefully you guys can see it a little bit better and increase the font to enormous size. So I moved down to Tampa, Florida 3 years ago or so. Before that, I spent most of my life in Louisville, Kentucky. So a lot of my demo applications revolve around thoroughbred horse racing. So I've been kind of using this same data set and application for a variety of different demos. So this is about thoroughbred horse racing and thoroughbred horses specifically, and kind of their stats. So we'll just click play and we'll show you that this is just a new .NET Core MVC project with a new horses page, which shows a list of thoroughbred horses, some stats about the particular horses, and if we go in and look at some of the detail of a horse, we can see some additional information about the horse and a pretty little picture, right? Nothing fancy, but this is just kind of a file new MVC project and a couple endpoints connected up to a database using in .NET Core and EF Core for ORM. So just by clicking play and doing all this stuff, we can hit an error, and running in debug mode in the development environment, we can get our pretty error page. It'll give us a stack trace and queries and headers and all kinds of information that we have, right? So this is great, except if you're running in a production environment, maybe you don't have access to that, right? So maybe you've got, we'll just do it, fake it here. Maybe they've got the pretty error messages turned on. And we'll wait for it to load. So the pretty error message is on. We don't get the stack trace anymore. We've got maybe a request ID that hopefully we've got somewhere that we can go in and get the information, right? And maybe the design department has gotten a hold of our error page and it's even prettier than this and gives us even less information, right? Anybody work with those fine folks? I love what they do, but man, if we didn't do our job and added the logging and stuff to begin with, that'll make it difficult. So anybody working with a production environment that has pretty error pages and then you can't connect to the production environment remotely debug, right? Yeah, typically that's a big no-no. Companies really aren't going to want you to have access to the production environment, or they're not going to want you to debug the live site when they're trying to make sales or whatever it is. They're trying to sell widgets or whatever, right? So anybody, most of us are developers. Most of us are .NET developers, correct? Yeah. IDE of choice, are we Visual Studio, VS Code, something? Yeah, so I still am a big Visual Studio guy, so lots of tools in here as well. So instead of running in IIS Express, I'll run in Kestrel and just run the actual web application itself. You can see that it starts up as a console application and then launches Kestrel to give us the web application. And it's going to go ahead and log some information straight to the console for us. Anybody, is this new for anybody? Anybody not seen this? Yeah. So this is great. This is, you get this pretty much out of the box as long as you do the file new VC project and let it spit out all the useless pages that we have in privacy and home and all that stuff. But you know, as we're doing this kind of stuff, we see that the initial request for this spent 406 milliseconds to get to the home index controller. So not bad. It's pretty interesting stuff. Pause there for a second. So we can see that it's doing, you know, it newed up Entity Framework for the context. It's logging out some of the calls to Entity Framework or through Entity Framework, so you can see a lot of this information. And this is great while you're developing, right? So as you're running through this process, you can see what's happening. But again, maybe you don't really have access to a lot of this stuff in a production environment, right? So we want to put that information somewhere. So this was just the file new MVC project. I'm going to switch branches over to console write line branch. And this is, you know, early in my development days in my career, I was, okay, we didn't have all these fancy little tools to write out to the console. So I'm just going to put in some debug information, right? So I'm going to console write line. Can everybody see that okay? Let me zoom in a little bit.
Get a little bigger.
Nope, not that big. All right, so this is our index for our horses controller. It's going to console write line, getting all horses, and just a timestamp on this. All right, so we want to kind of start deciding or start gathering information about how long it's taking this is the date timestamp from when we're getting the horses. This is the timestamp for when we're mapping the horses. So we've retrieved the horses, and then we've started mapping them to our DTO. Or to our view model, or whatever the case may be. And the demo gods are shining upon me. There we go. We can see that we made the call of getting all horses at 11:27 p.m. That's obviously incorrect. So 27 past the hour and 9 seconds, and then we're mapping the call from 27 past the hour and 14 seconds. So it realistically took about 5 seconds to make that call and start mapping. For whatever reason, my database locally kind of freaked out a little bit, but no big deal. Yeah. So not great, but that's the start of where we can start determining how long calls to the database are, or how long a call to a third-party application, calling out to an external API and getting data, right? But we don't really want to litter our application with all kinds of console write lines, right? And with that, we're still kind of stuck in an environment that we're probably not going to have access to a log or a console on a production server, right? This is probably still only going to be useful in development, and there's probably better ways.
Well, even if you did, somebody's got to sit there and watch it.
Right. Yeah. So
Goes off the screen.
yeah, and so maybe it's a timing thing. Maybe it's we know at 5 o'clock every day this thing happens. Well, yeah, you can log in maybe if you have access to that environment, and then you can start looking at some kind of console. But I don't want access to production. I never want access to any environment except maybe my local machine, maybe a development environment. But you know, if you can keep me out of production, I'll be happy. So you know, we decided that there's a better way to do this. We don't want to just do console write line everywhere. So we want to go in and in .NET Core there is an iLogger interface. So you can start logging directly. You can get hooks into the logging that's out of the box that we saw in our console earlier, and we can start logging directly to that instead. So we can see now in our messages, we still have the get all horses being logged at 30 past the hour and 7 seconds, and 30 past the hour and 7 seconds for mapping. So it took less than a second to do the call and the map there. But the difference here is that we're using an iLogger interface now. So that's straight out of, let's see which namespace that's in. So that's in the Microsoft Extensions logging package. And that just gives us a way to hook into that pipeline and decide that we're going to log the same information, but we're going to use our logger to do that for us. And the way to do that is open up your solution, manage, NuGet packages. Nope, you don't. Yep, actually that's straight out of the box. So we don't even need to add any NuGet stuff out of there. The only thing we did is call the, pass in the iLogger and give it a type of the controller itself, and it'll automatically log for you. So all kinds of magic straight out of the box. Clayton knows magic. Any questions so far? All right, so this is another kind of out of the box fun stuff, and really we didn't have to do a whole lot other than just add in the logger and pass that in, right? We did have to add in a little bit of configuration. In the program.cs, we needed to configure logging, and we're getting the configuration out of our app settings. So it's going to read in whatever logging level. So maybe you want different log levels for different environments. So for development environment, you want to have maybe verbose or debug or something like that, so you can collect all kinds of information. Maybe in upper environments, you really only want to collect warnings or errors, right? So you can kind of configure that a little bit differently based on maybe a deployment or something like that. So what we've done is we've added console and debug logging, and we're getting the event source logger and wiring that all up in startup. Right. So not really a whole lot of magic yet. We're still just really logging to consoles. We're still logging to in debug mode. We're not really collecting that information for later digestion, right? We're not going to do anything useful with it yet. There's a lot of logging frameworks out there. Anybody using any particular logging frameworks for .NET Framework, .NET Core?
We're starting in the Serialog.
Serialog, okay. What are some others that anybody have experience with? Log4net and Inlog. Yeah, Elma. So there's all kinds of providers out there, and they're all pretty much on par, because if one of them produces a new feature that the the market decides is the best new feature of any logging framework, the rest are going to quickly try to adopt it. So they're all pretty much on par. I think Serialog's probably the one most in favor these days, and I've got a demo for Serialog as well. And that's where I've gone in recent applications as well, because everyone seems to be enjoying it, and that's where all of the documentation is, and that's where all the samples and examples are. So can't go wrong there, right? So switching over to Serialog and letting my machine catch up for a second. We see that all of the program startup noise here has kind of been condensed down into just use Serialog. And in startup, we've added a log and a logger here by bringing in a NuGet package, probably a couple of different NuGet packages. So we've got Serialog for ASP.NET Core is the main one. Serialog settings configuration, so that we can read our configuration settings out of our app settings. And then a couple of different syncs. So Serialog provides what they call syncs of where you can output the logging information. So you can collect it and put it out to console. So we've added a console, we've added debug, and I've added SQL Server because I'm an old database guy and been working line of business applications, and line of business applications run on data, and data has to live somewhere. So SQL Server, why not? So a couple of different NuGet packages, a couple of settings in an app settings, one little line change in program CS, and a big old method in startup to add in all kinds of information. So we're reading from configuration, which is our app settings, and taking all of those app settings that are specific for Serialog, which is pretty much the same as our log level and logging information before, right? And we're configuring that. We're getting different column options, and we're auto creating the SQL table through using the same default connection, right? Then we're writing out to console, we're writing out to debug, we're writing out to SQL Server, and then we're creating logger. So our horses controller doesn't look any different. It's still using that iLogger interface. The difference is that Serialog has kind of grabbed it and said that one's mine. I know what to do with it. So it's kind of injected itself in there, that when you're writing to an iLogger, Serialog's going to take over for you, and it knows what to do. It's going to spit it out to SQL Server and console and debug and whatever else we configured in there, right? So now when I click play, we can see it's still going to go out to our console. It's a little bit prettier this time because Serialog has its own little formatter and it knows how to output colored information. So it's a little easier on the eyes. We can click on horses. I think we're still logging out that very useful log message. Maybe, yeah. So we're still spitting out the EF core query to get our horses. We're doing all that fun stuff. If we open up SQL Server and look, at 37 past the hour and 19 seconds, it's logging now to the database with really very little effort on our part. We added 5, 6 different NuGet packages, one line to program, and a block of code to startup, right? And really didn't have to change our controller where it's logging any information. And now if we hit an endpoint that's going to blow up, we're back to our ugly error message page because we didn't leave that comment out. And then we can see that we are actually logging exceptions to the database too. So this might be useful if you spotted your user in the hallway that said, "Hey, feature isn't working." You can go straight to the database and say, what time did you call that new feature?" And maybe they call it blue, it's the red feature, whatever. You can go in and, "Oh yeah, we actually logged an exception." And then you can start figuring out what that exception is. We've got line numbers, we've got the actual classes that were involved in that. So, everything you would expect to see in a stack trace, right? Useful. So I started playing around with Serialog a little bit more and deciding that, the configuration example that I found with throwing all this junk in your startup isn't really for me. I wanted a little bit cleaner. They've got a couple of different options. You can pass it an XML file. You can do the settings in your app settings, and that's kind of where I prefer to do things these days. There's other options as well, I'm sure. So I started actually playing around with this a little bit earlier today, and created a new branch for Serialog in config in the app settings. So we're deciding that we want to use these syncs, and from earlier we know that syncs are where the login information is being put. So it's going to be put in debug, console, and SQL Server. It's going to write to console. It's going to write to SQL Server. The console, you can actually provide it a template. So maybe you want it to be in a specific order. Maybe you don't like seeing the error messages in this format. You want it to be in a different format. You want whatever, collect different information. So you can you can provide your own format to the template, and then it will write out to that. Subsequently, for SQL Server, you provided a connection string. You tell it which table. You tell it if you want it to create the table. So if the table's not there, it'll try to create it for you. You can decide that you can provide additional columns. You can decide that for timestamp column, you want to use the UTC date timestamp. So we'll see the 7 whatever hour it is these days. And then we can enrich it with logging context, machine names, thread ID. You can override defaults, those types of things. So we can now see in our console, it's now, if I don't remember if you guys remember, but it's a little bit different format now. I'm spitting out the full name instead of an abbreviation for the logging level that is information. Inside the parentheses here, this is the correlation ID. So if you had different applications that were speaking to one another, a request was made from a MVC application to an API, to a third party, to a whatever, it'll create a unique identifier, pass it along that same request, and you can log that here and keep track of this error happened on this request on this machine in this part of the applications, making a request to this third-party application that returned, and you can get kind of the entire conversation that happened in a single request using just that correlation ID. So they got a little bit prettier. You can also change color. They've got some different color schemes that you can use. Nothing big and fancy there, but what we do see is that it's added some additional information here to the properties that it's logging. It's added a thread ID, it's added a connection ID, and it's added that same correlation ID to the body of the message that's being logged. You can also specify that you want to maybe make correlation ID a column in the table and outlog that directly to that. And that's what I've done in other applications as well. So it makes it a little bit easier to track some of that information. So, I mean, a lot of power here, and then you can start to decide or determine how you like to log these things, what is useful to you, especially as you're tracking down bugs and those types of things. You can say, this is helpful, this is what I'm most interested in, so you can kind of tackle it that way, right? So with that, so we've tackled logging a little bit now. So how do you determine that an application is up and running? Is it just it spit out a log message 3 seconds ago, so I guess it's running, right? How do you determine?
On startup, console right line.
Nice.
Started.
Console right line on startup. Nice. So in .NET Core, they've added in a health check middleware that is piggybacking on a third-party app or third-party application that I'll have to. I've got the documentation up in another window that we can dig through some of that as well. But what that does, and that's just another NuGet package, if I'm remembering correctly. We'll take a look. So Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Diagnostics.HealthChecks is another kind of middleware health check, and there's also HealthChecks.EntityFramework.Core that you can add. And what this allows you to do is by modifying startup to add health checks and optionally add DB context check. This will tell the service, the application as it's running, and then this line here to app.useHealthChecks, and then provide an endpoint that you want the application to respond to something on this endpoint and then run a check to see if it can connect to the database. You can write in some additional middleware code to check other various parts of your application to see if they have connectivity to a third-party API, if they have connectivity to maybe Active Directory or to maybe an Exchange server. Whatever your application needs to fulfill certain requests, you want to see, is it healthy? Is it actually accepting those requests? Is it able to connect to the database? Is it doing the things that I expect the application to do? So by doing that, just hitting a health endpoint, we can see that I got a healthy response. Just out of the box, I haven't added in any additional code to check a third-party API or anything like that. It is checking that this endpoint is hit and it can respond in a healthy manner. And with that optional DB health check is checking that it has a connection to the database and can communicate that way as well. So really with just a couple of little configs here, a couple lines in your startup, you can determine that your application is healthy enough to accept requests, right? With just a little bit more effort, you could determine that it's functioning throughout the life cycle of the application, right?
What's it do if you stop your SQL server?
Let's find out.
Yeah, just delete it.
No. We'll stop the service for a second. What do you think it's going to do?
Not help. Get greedy. Sick. That's not good.
Apparently, I don't know what pause does in services.
I wonder if because you already had a connection, if they kept it unhealthy.
Unhealthy. So, I mean,
There's a kick.
without a whole lot of work, that would be useful, right?
Yep.
Does anybody do anything similar or write your own endpoints to determine that, pass in a ping, do you get a pong response, something like that?
We're doing that. We have about 150 apps, and we have a system endpoint. We'll go and use ping them to go talk to.
Yeah, I pinged it. I got a pong response. that means it's doing. Is
You're
it doing anything besides that?
No.
Just response with a
Just
call.
the IAS is responsive.
Perfect. Okay. And is it in managed code? Is it in a .NET application? So it at least is running a process, not just
Yep.
replying with an HTTP response or something, or a HTML page. So
It's something.
it
It's a piece of data.
it's not nothing. So we'll start it up. Demo gods, be kind. Healthy. All right. So, I mean, useful, right? That provides us a so we've got some logging, we've got some rudimentary health checks that the application's functioning. You know, were you mentioning earlier that somebody has to log in and check something, right? No,
Oh,
so, yeah. So somebody, this might prevent somebody from having to log in and check something. They can at least just hit an endpoint while they're getting their coffee. Hey, look, it came back healthy. I'm gonna go get a donut.
We worked on a heartbeat program.
Yeah, so a heartbeat program, something like that. So useful, you know. Okay, fun stuff. And all kinds of additional middleware that you can hook into and just go nuts. So for whatever that's worth, do it in moderation. So what else? What are other things that people are doing? So another fun package that I found, or another project that I found that's a number of different projects, is a gentleman out of Australia running appmetrics.io. So there's a number of different NuGet packages that we can start looking at. So AppMetrics is a project by a gentleman out of Australia. It's open source, so plenty of contributors as well. The main NuGet packages that I'm adding here are just the ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core tracking, and reporting to InfluxDB. So I think you'd mentioned also that we don't have a dashboard. Anybody have dashboards where they work or on projects that they work on that say, yeah, that thing's working, we're good. Maybe even just an Azure DevOps or a TFS board to say the build succeeded or something. Dashboards are great because they're information radiators to tell you that yes, things are working, right? I love dashboards. I particularly love Grafana. So with our dashboard, we'll let that kick off and run. Give me back. By bringing in the AppMetrics stuff, I added an AppMetrics builder to report to an InfluxDB. So InfluxDB is an open source time-based database. So it'll take in essentially messages, I believe, for a lack of a better understanding on my part, honestly. And you can kind of report on the data as it's coming in. So it's just a stream of data coming in, and it'll process it and do whatever. So we create an endpoint for metrics to report to an InfluxDB. We're adding the metrics service to services with the metrics for InfluxDB. We want to report on the hosted service, and we want to track in the middleware. And then in the app, we want to use metrics for middleware and request tracking. So that's really just a lot of just a base example from their documentation to provide a way for us to say, yep, we're running, we did stuff, and it's logging somewhere something. InfluxDB is something that can run in a Docker container. Found a Docker Compose file that'll spin up two different Docker containers, one for InfluxDB and one for Grafana. Grafana is a reporting dashboard type interface that you can give it various data sources. You can give it Prometheus, you can give it whatever, one of which being InfluxDB. So with just a small little configuration, we'll take a look at what our compose file looks like. Anybody playing with Docker? So Docker is just a little lightweight container that has just a bare bones operating system running it on top of a virtualized container on the underlying OS, I guess. But it provides a way to run something, perhaps one little thing in a container, and you can spin that up with the same environment settings repeatedly. So we've got two different containers in this compose file. So we've got one for Influx, and we've got one for Grafana, and then we create a couple of different volumes. That's essentially giving it a place to store its data. And then we'll run Docker Compose up, hopefully. Come on. And it'll start doing stuff. So what this is doing is ingesting all of those messages that were being spit out by our application and rerunning those, because I've done this a couple of times now. And if we go to the Grafana dashboard that I created earlier, by logging into the endpoint that is exposed from that Docker container, we can see that we're starting to collect information based on the endpoints that we've already hit, based on all this fun stuff, that we haven't had any errors in this time series in the last 5 minutes. But if I go in and hit our bad endpoint, we can see that once it ingests some of this information, we've got some details on the endpoints that are being hit. We've got an uncaught exception here for the get versus detail. So we can start to see where those errors are occurring and maybe be a little bit proactive. We've got one error 100% caught for a single error, whatever. There's some explanation. So this is also from the gentleman's, the Australian gentleman's sample application. So there's an AppDex score, which I looked up what AppDex meant, but it's essentially, I believe it's like a user score of how it's doing. So, you know, a lot of useful information if you dive through and maybe configure the dashboard to show what's meaningful and relevant to you, or what's meaningful and relevant to the people that write the paychecks, essentially, right? So we want to make sure that they see our value, that we can catch the errors, we can see the bottlenecks and respond accordingly, right? I love Grafana. It's going to be in all my demos, just I warn you. What's that?
Datadog.
Datadog?
Yep.
Do they use? Can you
It's a service.
do they use Grafana, or can you use Grafana with it?
I don't know.
They need to, or you need to.
Grafana-like, so you can build your graphs right in.
Yeah. So if you haven't played around with Grafana, it's another little fun stuff. All this is in my GitHub, so you can pull it all down and run with it. It's going to be great. So yeah, another maybe useful thing if you've got a television that you can put up and make an information radiator with, right? So if we're mostly .NET developers, mostly Visual Studio developers, or Visual Studio users of when we're creating our applications, anybody see the application insights checkbox and it's annoying you and saying, do you want to add application insights? No, well, maybe, I don't know. Don't know enough about it, right? So here's an application insights demo. We're doing the same kind of thing. You can actually, if you didn't check that box when you created a new application, you can right click on your project, and somewhere in this mess, you can add application insights. Maybe if you've already done it, you can. Oh, there we go. Add application insights telemetry. And it will walk you through setting it up. You have to pick your project. You have to be logged into an Azure account. You can get a free account or a limited account. You can do kind of that fun stuff. I've got even a newer one, but we're not going to do that. So, but we can run this, and we can start sending this application insight data up in Azure, even though my application isn't deployed to Azure. it's still going to send that data up there and hopefully give us something useful up there, right? Really,
We'll put a lot into Visual Studio App Insights window or something too.
there is the diagnostic tools that you can get a lot of additional information. Is there, here's the application insights, events and summary and memory usage. There's probably an App Insights plugin or additional window or feature or something that I just haven't played around with a whole lot. But if you go into your Azure instance, you can create a dashboard, because we all love dashboards. You can make this one your dashboard if you don't like Grafana. And then you can see your reliability, your usage, and your failed requests, and all kinds of information. You can go into the resource itself if you don't like the dashboard. And we can start looking at failed requests and availability and sample server requests and fulfilled requests, and go in and collect some of the sample data and see that, oh, look, it's logging the images that were returned. It's logging the requests. It's seeing how long it was doing any particular request. So this entire request came in, got a 200 response, and the response time was 740 milliseconds. So locally on my laptop and hitting a SQL server on my laptop that has been flaky for me today because it's demo time, and then spitting all that telemetry up to Azure and App Insights, right? So cool stuff. And of course, Serialog has a sync for application insights. So I added that today as well. So that's just another little config, another little NuGet package. So Serialog syncs application insights. In our app settings, because we've switched this one to use the app settings for Serialog, we added application insights as a sync. In addition to writing to console and writing to SQL Server, I'm also now writing to application insights. We're restricted to information here, and we're using telemetry for application insights for the trace converter as well. I think there's another option that you can do something besides trace telemetry. So if we click play on this one, we're still logging everything to the database. We're still logging everything to the console. We still have our health endpoint middleware check to verify that the thing's up and running. We're hitting courses. We're hitting our detail. We go back to Azure. And you can do some fun stuff to look at live stream of your metrics collection, right? You can see, look, I'm going to go back to horses, and then I'm going to go to the detail, and then I'm going to hit the error page. And we can see all the incoming requests and the request failure rate and the exceptions and the outgoing requests and the overall health, just by adding the Serialog sync and then one little line to your, where was it? Startup, no, program, something. Oh, it does, if you right click on the project and add application insights, it'll modify your program CS, and so it'll add this use application insights to your program, and then you'll have to add in into the app settings JSON by default your instrumentation key, and you can get that through Azure as well. So I think my instrumentation key actually made it into GitHub as well, so feel free to use that until I'm out of credits, whatever. I'll go through and delete that a little bit later. But that's enough to make you dangerous, to get you started on logging data to to console, to a debug window, to SQL Server. There are file syncs, so if everything went to hell and your database is offline and everything, log it straight to a file. That could really come in handy. The DevOps expert in the room, what would you suggest for logging and metrics and analytics and all of this?
Love it all. We do a rolling file,
File.
for errors and above.
Okay. Rolling file errors and above.
That makes it real easy. So if nothing
You're not
else
going to
is
run out of
working,
space because it's rolling.
It's rolling. We log it to Seek, which is a third-party logging system. We use Datadog on top of it to dashboard.
Yeah, so serial log to sync, Datadog, dashboard.
Do it all. Log as much as you can where it makes sense, because there is overhead on logging.
Yeah, if you ever turn on verbose logging, you're going to fill up a database quick. We were actually tracking down a pretty serious bug that slipped into production, and I turned on verbose logging for an hour, I think, and I think we got 30,000 records. And this is a small application that's used by maybe 10 people. So we can burn through some stuff, and that might have been even over lunch. So it happened to be somebody that was doing a little bit of work, and we collected all the information we could ever need. So
Having those settings in the app settings allows you to up and down live without having to take the app down.
yeah, because in the first serial log example, all the settings I was doing just hard coded in the C# in the code. So that makes it really difficult. You're going to have to deploy something to get a logging change out there, right? So you want to make sure you get all those settings in some place that you can change pretty quickly. What other things are people doing to make sure that their application is healthy, that they're collecting enough information that they can go to their boss and say, look, what a good job I'm doing? What are the things that people are doing? Nothing? Something along these lines? You're going to take the GitHub repo and go and implement this now? All right. Anybody have any questions? Everybody ready for beer? All right. Well, that's all I've got for you guys. So unless there's anything else, appreciate you coming out. I am, of course, available for questions and answers. If you want to hit me up later, I do have this example in GitHub with all of these branches. So the master branch is just the file new project with the courses endpoints on there, as well as a database project and some SQL data to seed your database. Then all the respective branches for everything we walk through here as well. So I would encourage you to implement what you think would be useful. If you have questions or concerns, feel free to reach out and let me know, or anybody's willing to give a help. So with that, appreciate you all coming to talk. We'll hit up the avenue down the street. So looking for speakers and topics for next month and the future. So with that, I think Clayton's got handed out tickets, and we're going to go ahead and raffle off a book here.
There's a lot of stuff.
You want me to come over there?
You do all the work today.
All right, so we've got C# in depth, the 4th edition by Mr. John Skeet, famous for Stack Overflow and other things. So that's covering all the way up through C# 7.2, if I'm remembering correctly. Certainly through 7. So everybody got a ticket?
I'd rather hit the lottery.
I don't have any control over either, honestly. All right, so 340144. All right.
I know this song, so the 144.
Nice.